Some wounds never heal. They just learn to hide beneath calloused hands and guarded hearts. For 10 years, Marion Pike has lived alone in her mountain cabin, convinced that gentle touch was something that happened to other women in other lives. When traveling blacksmith Jed Boone arrives with a broken wagon wheel, she offers him supper out of simple courtesy. Neither expects the week that follows. As he mends his wheel, something deeper begins to mend between them. Two people who had given up on love find themselves daring to hope again. But what happens when someone touches your heart after years of protecting it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Teton Peaks like a prayer half-spoken, and Marion Pike watched it from her kitchen window as she had every dawn for the past decade. Her coffee steamed in the chipped ceramic mug, the same one she'd carried from her old life, though everything else from those days had been left behind or buried deep. The wooden cross her father had carved hung above the stone fireplace, catching the first rays of sunlight that managed to pierce through the pine boughs surrounding her cabin. At 52, Marion's hands told the story of her survival. Calloused from splitting kindling, scarred from gutting fish, and permanently stained from tanning hides, they were hands that had learned to do what needed doing without complaint. Her face bore the weathering of mountain winters and the lines that came from squinting against snow glare, but her eyes remained clear and watchful, missing nothing in the wilderness that had become both her sanctuary and her prison. The cabin itself stood as testament to her determination. What had started as a rough-hewn shelter had grown over the years into something approaching comfort. She'd chinked every gap between the logs herself, laid the stone foundation with rocks hauled from the creek bed, and built the furniture piece by piece during the long winter evenings. The main room served as kitchen, dining room, and parlor, with a loft bedroom accessible by a ladder she'd constructed from mountain pine. Every nail, every board, every improvement had been earned through her own labor. Her daily routine had become as regular as the sunrise. Check the snares before breakfast, tend the small garden that somehow thrived in the short growing season, mend whatever needed mending, prepare for the coming winter, regardless of the season. The isolation that had once felt crushing had gradually become a comfortable rhythm. She knew every sound the cabin made, every call of the birds that nested in her eaves, every shift in the wind that preceded a storm. But it was in the evening hours, when the work was done and the fire crackled low, that the memories surfaced like sediment stirred from the bottom of a still pond. She'd tried for years to forget Thomas Hartwell, the man she'd married at 23 with such hope in her heart. The early days had been sweet enough. He'd been charming when he wanted something, attentive when others were watching. But behind closed doors, Thomas had revealed himself to be a man who believed his wife was property to be controlled, corrected, and kept in line. The bruises had been easy to hide at first. A long-sleeved dress covered the fingerprints on her arms. Powder could mask the purple beneath her eyes. But as the years passed, Thomas had grown bolder, more careless, more convinced of his right to discipline what he considered his possession. The final night, the night that had driven her to flee into the mountains with nothing but the clothes on her back and her father's old rifle still, visited her in dreams. She'd awakened to find Thomas standing over her bed, drunk and furious about some perceived slight from earlier in the day. His hands had found her throat, and in that moment of absolute terror, something inside her had snapped. Not broken, snapped into clarity. She would not die at the hands of a man who had sworn to love and protect her. When he'd finally passed out, she'd gathered what little she could carry and walked into the darkness, never looking back. The mountains had nearly killed her that first winter. She'd known nothing about survival, nothing about hunting or trapping or preserving food. But desperation had proven a capable teacher, and the alternative, returning to Tomashad, made every hardship bearable. By spring, she'd learned to set snares for rabbits and grouse. By her second summer, she could tan a hide and smoke meat. By her third year, she'd become someone Thomas would barely recognize as strong, self-sufficient, and utterly beyond his reach. The coffee tin on the top shelf of her pantry held more than just grounds. Hidden beneath the fragrant beans was a small cloth bundle containing the wedding ring she'd never been able to bring herself to throw away. Not because she harbored any sentiment for the marriage that had died long before she fled, but because it served as a reminder, a talisman of sorts, ensuring she never forgot the price of trusting the wrong person with her heart. Her reflection caught in the window as the sun climbed higher, and she saw what the years had carved from her face. She wasn't the frightened young woman who'd run into these mountains, but neither was she the carefree girl who'd walked down the aisle with Thomas. She was something else, entirely tempered by hardship, strengthened by solitude, and wrapped in protective armor that had kept her safe but also kept her alone. The sound of her own voice had become foreign to her ears. Days would pass without her speaking aloud, though she sometimes found herself humming her mother's old hymns while she worked. The silence had become so complete that when storms raged through the peaks, the thunder seemed like conversation after too long without words. She'd convinced herself that this was enough. The cabin provided shelter, the land provided sustenance, and the isolation provided safety. What more could a woman of her circumstances expect? Romance was for young girls who hadn't learned the difference between a man's sweet words and his true nature. Love was a luxury she couldn't afford, a risk she'd taken once and paid for in ways that still ached on cold mornings. Yet sometimes, in the moments between sleep and waking, she'd catch herself wondering what it might feel like to have someone's gentle hand smooth the hair from her forehead, or to fall asleep listening to another person's breathing beside her. These thoughts came rarely and were quickly dismissed, but they persisted like seeds that somehow found purchase in the rocky soil of her carefully guarded heart. The morning chores beckoned, and Marion finished her coffee with the same methodical precision she applied to everything in her carefully ordered life. She would check the snares, tend the garden, repair the loose board on the porch steps that had been bothering her for weeks. The day would unfold according to plan, as they all did, in the rhythm she'd established to keep the loneliness at bay. But as she reached for her jacket, something made her pause at the window for one last look at the trail that wound down from the mountain pass. It was empty, as it always was, disappearing into the forest like a question without an answer. She'd stopped expecting anyone to travel that path years ago, had trained herself not to hope for the sight of another human being making their way toward her refuge. The cross above the fireplace caught her eye once more, and she whispered the same prayer she'd offered every morning for the past 10 years, not for deliverance or rescue, but for the strength to face another day with dignity intact and her hard-won peace undisturbed. The mountains had taught her that survival was enough, that safety was worth any price, even the price of perpetual solitude. She had no way of knowing that this particular morning was different from all the others that had come before, no way of sensing that by evening, everything about her carefully constructed world would begin to shift. The trail she'd watched for so many years without hope would soon carry someone toward her door, someone who would challenge every assumption she'd made about trust, about touch, about the possibility that her heart might still remember how to hope. But for now, there were only the morning chores and the familiar rhythm of a life lived in the spaces between memory and dream, between the woman she'd been and the woman she'd had to become. The sound came first as a distant creaking, barely audible above the whisper of wind through the pines. Marion froze with her hand on the garden gate, every sense suddenly alert. In 10 years of mountain solitude, she'd learned to distinguish between the innocent sounds of wilderness and those that might signal danger. This was neither. It was the unmistakable protest of wood under strain, the groan of an axle bearing too much weight. A wagon. Someone was coming up the trail. Her first instinct was to retreat into the cabin and wait with her rifle until whoever it was passed by. But as the sound grew closer, it became clear that the wagon was struggling. The creaking grew more pronounced, punctuated by the occasional sharp crack that spoke of something failing under pressure. Against her better judgment, curiosity drew her toward the front of her property where the trail curved past her gate. Through the trees, she caught her first glimpse of the traveler, a man, hunched over the reins of a tired-looking mule, his wagon listing heavily to one side. Even from a distance, she could see the problem. The rear wheel on the driver's side was wobbling dangerously, held in place by what appeared to be little more than hope and stubbornness. As she watched, the wheel gave a particularly violent shudder, and the man pulled the mule to a stop just short of her property line. He sat there for a long moment, shoulders sagging with what looked like resignation rather than relief. When he finally climbed down from the wagon seat, Marion could see he favored his left leg, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to work around old pain. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps in his early 40s, with graying hair that curled slightly at his collar and hands that bore the distinctive burn scars of a blacksmith. The broken wagon wheel demanded his immediate attention. As Marion watched from her concealed position behind the pine trees, he knelt beside the damaged wheel with the focused attention of a craftsman assessing a problem. His examination was thorough and gentle, his hands moving over the splintered wood and bent iron with the same care a doctor might show a patient. When he finally sat back on his heels, the expression on his weathered face told the whole story. This wasn't something that could be fixed with whatever tools he carried. Thunder rumbled overhead, and Marion glanced up to see storm clouds gathering above the peaks with the swift certainty of mountain weather. The stranger looked up as well, and she saw him calculate the same thing she had. There wasn't time to make it to the nearest town before the storm hit. His shoulders squared as he stood, preparing to unhitch the mule and make whatever shelter he could manage. That was when her father's voice echoed in her memory, as clear as if he was standing beside her. "A person stranded in the mountains isn't a stranger, Marion girl. They're a neighbor in need." He'd lived by that code all his life, had taught her that hospitality wasn't just courtesy in the wilderness, it was survival. Help offered today might be help received tomorrow. But that was before Thomas. Before she'd learned that kindness could be mistaken for weakness, that opening her door to someone could lead to losing control of her own life. The internal battle played out quickly, her father's teachings against her hard-earned caution, basic human decency against self-preservation. The first fat raindrops made the decision for her. "You there?" she called out, stepping from behind the trees with her rifle held low but visible. "That wheel's not taking you anywhere tonight." The man turned toward her voice, and she got her first clear look at his face. There was something immediately reassuring about his expression: surprise, yes, but no calculation, no measuring look that might suggest he was evaluating her as prey. His eyes were the color of weathered leather, lined at the corners from squinting into forge fires, and when he smiled, it was with genuine relief rather than the practiced charm she'd learned to distrust. "No, ma'am, I don't believe it is," he agreed, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that spoke of ingrained courtesy. "Name's Jed Boone. I'm a traveling smith, and I appear to be in something of a predicament." "Marion Pike," she replied, maintaining her distance. "And that predicament's about to get worse. Storm's coming, and these mountains don't show mercy to folks caught in the open." Jed glanced up at the darkening sky, then back at his broken wagon. "I don't suppose there's anywhere nearby where a man might—" "There's a lean, two behind my cabin," Marion found herself saying, the words emerging before she could fully consider them. "Dry enough for you and your mule, but I'll need to see what you're carrying before I offer shelter." It was a reasonable request, and Jed nodded without hesitation. He moved to the back of his wagon and began untying the canvas cover, his movements economical despite his limp. What he revealed put Marion somewhat at ease: the tools of his trade, neatly organized and well-maintained. Hammers and tongs, an anvil that could be broken down for transport, bars of iron in various sizes, and a small forge that showed the careful design of someone who understood both function and necessity. "Nothing here but what a blacksmith needs to make his living," Jed said simply. "Though I understand your caution. Woman living alone up here, well, you'd be a fool not to be careful." The acknowledgement of her situation without judgment or pity struck her as both wise and respectful. Here was a man who understood that her wariness came from experience, not paranoia. The first drops of rain were falling more steadily now, and practical considerations began to outweigh her reservations. "Bring your mule around back," she said, gesturing toward the narrow path that led to her cabin. "There's hay in the lean, too, and water in the trough. You can make camp there for the night." "That's mighty generous of you, Miss Pike," Jed said. And something in the way he said her name with genuine respect, rather than the possessive tone she'd learned to fear made her think this decision might not be entirely foolish. As he began unhitching his mule, Marion retreated to her cabin porch to watch the proceedings from a safe distance. The storm was building quickly now, and she could see Jed working with practiced efficiency despite his injured leg. He spoke softly to his mule, a gentle murmur of reassurance as he led the animal toward shelter. There was something about the way he moved, the care he showed for his beast of burden, that spoke of a fundamentally decent nature. But decency could be an act, she reminded herself. Thomas had been decent in public, charming even. It was only behind closed doors that his true nature had emerged. Still, watching Jed secure his mule and ensure the animal's comfort before seeing to his own needs suggested a character that was either genuinely considerate or so skilled at deception that she was already lost. The rain began in earnest as Jed finished his preparations, and Marion found herself calling out, "There's hot coffee if you want some, and cornbread left from breakfast." The words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise him. He paused in securing his wagon cover and looked toward where she stood on the porch, rain beginning to drip from the brim of his hat. "That's kind of you," he said, "but I don't want to impose beyond the shelter you've already offered. Storm like this, a man could catch his death trying to stay warm with nothing but wet canvas," she replied, practical considerations overriding her caution. "Come up to the porch when you're finished. Mind you, wipe your boots." As she disappeared into the cabin to put coffee on to heat, Marion wondered what her father would think of this momentous daughter offering hospitality to a stranger for the first time in a decade. She suspected he'd be proud, but she also knew he'd never had to learn the hard lessons about trust that had shaped her adult life. The broken wagon wheel sat in the gathering storm, a testament to the fragility of even the most carefully laid plans. Neither Marion nor Jed could have guessed that this mechanical failure would prove to be the first crack in the carefully constructed walls she'd built around her heart, or that the simple act of offering shelter to a stranded traveler would set them both on a path towards something neither had dared to hope for. Morning arrived with the crisp clarity that followed mountain storms, and Marion woke to the unfamiliar sound of someone moving about outside her cabin. For a moment, panic seized her, the instinctive fear of a woman who had lived alone too long before memory returned. The blacksmith, Jed Boone. She'd given him shelter for the night. She dressed quickly and moved to the kitchen window, coffee tin in hand. Through the glass, she could see him tending to his mule, his movements careful but efficient, despite the early hour. He'd respected her boundaries completely the night before, accepting the coffee and cornbread she'd offered, but refusing her tentative invitation to come inside when the storm had grown particularly fierce. Instead, he'd made himself comfortable on the covered porch, and their conversation had been conducted through the screen, door close enough for courtesy, distant enough for safety. The coffee was nearly ready when she heard his gentle knock on the door frame. "Miss Pike? I hope I didn't wake you. Wanted to get an early start looking at that wheel." "You didn't wake me," she called back, surprised by how easily the lie came. In truth, she'd slept poorly, unused to the presence of another person so close to her sanctuary. "Coffee's almost ready if you want some." When she opened the door, he was standing a respectful distance back, his hat in his hands. The morning light revealed details she'd missed in yesterday's storm, the careful way he held himself to favor his injured leg, the premature silver threading through hair that might once have been dark brown, and most notably, the blacksmith's hammer that hung from his belt like a badge of office. The hammer was obviously old, its wooden handle worn smooth by years of use, the metal head bearing the small dents and scars that spoke of countless hours at the forge. But it was more than just a tool in Jed's hands. It seemed to belong there, with the same natural fit as a musician's instrument or a painter's brush. When he'd examined his broken wheel the previous evening, she'd noticed how he'd used it not just to test the damaged spokes, but with an almost artistic precision, tapping and listening to the metal fittings with the focused attention of someone who could read stories in the sound of metal on metal. "That wheel's in worse shape than I hoped," Jed said, accepting the coffee cup she offered. "The hub's cracked clean through, and two of the spokes are beyond saving. It's not a repair job, it needs to be rebuilt entirely." Marion studied his face, looking for signs of frustration or anger at this setback, but found only the calm acceptance of someone accustomed to working around problems. "How long will that take?" 3 days, maybe 4 if I have to forge new fittings." He sipped his coffee and gazed toward the mountains. "That is, if you don't mind me setting up my forge in your yard. I know it's an imposition, but—" "It's not an imposition," she said, the words coming more quickly than she'd intended. "I mean, you're welcome to do what needs doing." The surprise that flickered across his features made her realize how abrupt she'd sounded, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. When had she become so awkward around simple human interaction? But Jed's smile was gentle, without a trace of mockery. "I'm grateful for your kindness," he said simply, "and I promise to stay out of your way as much as possible." As the morning progressed, Marion found herself watching his work with growing fascination. Jed set up his portable forge with the methodical precision of someone who had done this countless times, each piece of equipment placed exactly where it needed to be for maximum efficiency. When he lit the fire and began working the bellows, the familiar sounds of a blacksmith's trade echoed off the surrounding mountains, the hiss of hot metal meeting water, the rhythmic ring of hammer on anvil, the crackling voice of the forge itself. But it was the way he worked that captured her attention. There was nothing hurried or careless about his movements. Each strike of the hammer seemed calculated, purposeful. When he heated a piece of iron, he watched it like a mother watching a sleeping child, waiting for exactly the right moment to shape it. His hands, scarred from years of forge work, moved with the confidence of complete familiarity. Yet there was an artistry to what he did that elevated mere repair work into something approaching craft. "You're staring," she told herself, but found it difficult to look away. It had been so long since she'd watched someone else work, since she'd observed the quiet satisfaction that came from skilled hands solving problems. Her own work was about survival trapping, fishing, preserving food, maintaining her cabin, necessary work, but not work that created beauty. Jed's efforts, even in service of something as mundane as a wagon wheel, carried an aesthetic quality that spoke of pride in craftsmanship. During the noon break, when he banked his fire and came to the well for water, she found herself offering lunch without quite meaning to. "There's venison stew," she said, "more than I can eat by myself." "That's kind of you," he replied, and she noticed he didn't immediately accept, instead waiting to see if the offer was genuine or merely polite. "I made too much yesterday," she added, which was true enough. "It'll just go to waste otherwise." They ate on the porch, a careful distance between them, on the old wooden bench she'd built the previous spring. The conversation came easier than it had the night before, perhaps because daylight made everything seem less dangerous, or perhaps because watching him work had begun to dissolve some of her wariness. "You do fine work," she said, nodding toward the forge, where he'd already shaped 2 new spokes and begun work on the hub repair. "My father's trade," Jed replied. "He started teaching me when I was barely tall enough to reach the anvil. Said a man who could work iron would never want for employment, and he was right about that." "Is he still?" she began, then caught herself. Personal questions led to personal answers, and she wasn't ready for that level of conversation. But Jed seemed to understand her hesitation. "He passed some years back," he said without apparent pain. "Good death, though in his own bed, surrounded by family. Not everyone gets that blessing." There was something in the way he said it that suggested he'd seen other kinds of death, the harder kinds that came suddenly and without warning. The war, perhaps, though she didn't ask. Instead, she found herself saying, "He taught you well. I can see the care you put into the work." "Care's the most important part," Jed agreed. "Iron remembers how it's treated. Hurry it or force it, and it'll break when you need it most." But take your time, listen to what it's telling you, and it'll serve faithfully for generations." Something in those words resonated with her in a way she hadn't expected, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. As they finished their meal in companionable silence, Marion realized that for the first time in 10 years, she wasn't counting the minutes until she could be alone again. Instead, she found herself looking forward to the afternoon's work, to the sound of his hammer ringing against the mountain silence, to the quiet presence of someone who understood the value of patience and care. It was a dangerous realization, and she knew it. But as Jed returned to his forge and the rhythmic music of his craft began again, she allowed herself to enjoy the simple pleasure of human company, if only for a little while. By the second evening, the initial awkwardness had settled into something resembling routine. Jed worked at his forge during the daylight hours, the steady rhythm of his hammer providing a counterpoint to Marion's own daily tasks. She found herself timing her chores to coincide with his breaks, offering water when he banked his fire, bringing him a cold biscuit when the afternoon heat made the forge work particularly demanding. As sunset painted the peaks in shades of rose and gold, they sat on her porch with their evening coffee, the day's work behind them. The silence between them had grown comfortable, no longer charged with the tension of strangers trying to measure each other's intentions. When Jed finally spoke, his voice carried the reflective quality that seemed to emerge naturally in the mountain twilight. "This is beautiful country," he said, gesturing toward the view that stretched away from her cabin. "Must be something living in a place like this year-round." "It has its challenges," Marion replied, thinking of the brutal winters when the snow piled higher than her windows, the isolation that could feel crushing when storms lasted for weeks. "But it's honest. The mountains don't lie to you about what they are." Something in her tone must have revealed more than she'd intended, because Jed glanced at her with those perceptive eyes. "Sounds like you've had your fill of things that weren't honest." It was a gentle opening, an invitation to share rather than a demand, and perhaps that was why she found herself answering. "I was married once, long time ago. Turned out I didn't know him as well as I thought I did." "Bad marriage has a way of teaching hard lessons," Jed said quietly. "I'm sorry you had to learn them." The absence of prying questions, of demands for details, made her feel safer than she'd expected. Most people, when presented with hints about a failed marriage, wanted to dig deeper, to uncover the dramatic details. Jed simply accepted her words and offered his sympathy without conditions. "What about you?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. "Ever been married?" "No, ma'am. Came close once, before the war." He was quiet for a long moment, and she thought he might not continue. "Then she was a good woman, deserved better than what I came back as." There was pain in those words, carefully contained but unmistakable. Marion found herself looking at his injured leg, remembering the careful way he moved, the slight hesitation in his gait. "The war changed a lot of men." "Changed some more than others," Jed agreed. "I was lucky, I suppose. Kept my limbs, kept my mind mostly intact. But I brought something back with me that didn't belong in a peaceful life. Sarah saw it, even when I tried to hide it. She was wise enough to step away before I could damage what we had." The honesty in his confession struck her deeply. Here was a man willing to acknowledge his own limitations, his own capacity for harm. It was the opposite of Thomas, who had never admitted fault, never accepted responsibility for the pain he caused. "Do you regret it?" she asked, letting her go. "Every day," Jed said without hesitation. "But not for the reasons you might think. I don't regret losing. Hirsch deserved the chance to find happiness with someone who could give her peace. I regret that the war took away my ability to be that man for her, or for anyone, really." The conversation had taken a turn toward deeper waters, and Marion felt the familiar urge to retreat, to redirect toward safer topics. But something kept her in her chair, some curiosity about this man who spoke of his own flaws with such clear-eyed acceptance. "What did you bring back?" she asked quietly. Jed was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old nightmares. "Dreams, mostly." and a startled response that could be dangerous to anyone who surprised me. I woke up one night with my hands around Sarah's throat because she'd tried to shake me out of a nightmare. That was when I knew I had to leave. The admission hung between them in the gathering darkness. Marion should have been frightened here, was a man confessing to violence, to dangerous instincts that emerged without conscious control. Instead, she found herself thinking of her father's old Bible tucked away in her bedroom dresser. Between its pages, pressed like a bookmark, were wildflowers she'd picked as a child during family picnics in the high meadows. Her mother had helped her arrange them in the book, telling her that beautiful things could be preserved, even when their time in the world was brief. Those flowers had survived decades now, their colors faded, but their forms intact. They represented a time when her world had been safe, when the men in her life had protected rather than threatened. Looking at Jed in the dim porch light, she saw something of that same preservation, not of innocence, but of goodness despite damage. "How long ago was that?" she asked. 15 years, near enough. I've been traveling ever since, never staying anywhere long enough to—" He stopped, seeming to realize the implications of what he was saying. "To hurt anyone," Marion finished gently. "To disappoint anyone," he corrected. "There's a difference, though maybe not much of one." "There's a big difference," she said with more conviction than she'd expected. "Disappointment heals. The other thing that leaves scars that never fade." Jed turned to look at her directly, and she saw understanding pass between them. They were both damaged goods, both carrying wounds that had shaped the choices they'd made about how to live. But there was also recognition there, the acknowledgement that damage didn't necessarily mean worthlessness. "I should probably tell you," Jed said carefully, "that I still have those dreams sometimes, not as often as before, but they come. If you'd rather I made camp farther away—" "You haven't hurt anyone in 15 years, Marion interrupted. "That speaks to who you are, not who you were." The gratitude in his expression was almost painful to witness. When was the last time someone had given him the benefit of the doubt, had seen his efforts at self-control as evidence of character rather than proof of inherent danger? "Besides," she added, surprising herself again, "I'm not exactly defenseless, and I'm a light sleeper." That earned her a small smile, the first she'd seen from him that reached his eyes. "I don't doubt that, Miss Pike. You strike me as someone who's learned to take care of herself." "I have," she agreed, "but it's nice to know I don't always have to." The words slipped out before she could stop them, revealing more vulnerability than she'd shown to anyone in years. But as they sat in the comfortable darkness, listening to the night sounds of the mountains, Marion realized she didn't regret the admission. For the first time in a decade, she was beginning to remember what it felt like to trust another person, even in small ways. And for the first time since her marriage had ended, that prospect didn't terrify her completely. The third morning brought a shift that Marion felt before she fully understood it. She woke not to the sound of Jed moving about outside, but to the gentle rhythm of rain on her cabin roof. Through her bedroom window, she could see him working under the lean-to, his forge glowing warm against the grey dawn, the steady ring of his hammer muffled by the weather. Without quite deciding to do it, she found herself making breakfast for 2 flapjacks and bacon, more than she'd cooked for herself in years. When she stepped onto the porch with a plate and cup, Jed looked up from his work with surprise and something that might have been pleasure. "Thought you might be hungry," she said, setting the food on the small table he'd fashioned from sawhorses and an old board. "No sense working on an empty stomach." "You don't need to," he began, but she cut him off with a look. "I know I don't need to. I want to." The distinction seemed to mean something to him, because he set down his hammer and washed his hands in the basin she'd left for him. As they ate together under the shelter of the lean-to, rain drumming overhead, Marion found herself studying his face in the forge light. The harsh lines she'd first noticed were still there, but they seemed softer somehow, as if the past few days had reminded him how to relax. "Tell me about your travels," she said, surprising herself again with her willingness to prolong the conversation. "You must have seen a lot of country." Jed smiled, and she realized she was beginning to recognize the different qualities of his expressions, the polite smile he wore for strangers, the rueful one that accompanied talk of his past, and this one, which seemed genuinely warm. More than I ever planned to, that's certain. Started out thinking I'd just wander for a season or two, clear my head after the war. That was 15 years ago. He gestured toward the mountains visible through the rain. But there's something about moving that becomes its own reason. Always another town over the next hill, always someone who needs something fixed. Don't you get lonely? The question slipped out before she could stop it, too personal and too revealing of her own state of mind. Sometimes, he admitted, but lonely on the road is different from lonely in one place. When you're traveling, you can always tell yourself the next town might be different. The next job might lead to something better. When you're staying put, well, that's when you have to face what you're really running from. His words struck closer to home than she cared to admit. Wasn't her mountain sanctuary just another form of running? A beautiful, self-sufficient prison where she could hide from the possibility of being hurt again. "What are you running from?" she asked quietly. Jed was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "The possibility that I might hurt someone I care about," he said finally. "And maybe, if I'm being honest, the possibility that I might not. That I might find someone willing to take the risk and then discover I'm not worth it." The raw honesty of his words made her chest tighten. She understood both fears intimately, the terror of causing harm and the perhaps greater terror of being found wanting when someone looked too closely. "I have a photograph," she found herself saying, the words emerging from some deep place she'd kept locked for years. "Of my parents, taken when I was small, maybe 6 or 7 years old." She paused, wondering why she was sharing this, but Jed waited with the patient attention he seemed to give everything, and the words continued to come. "They were happy," she said simply, "really happy, in the way people are when they fit together perfectly. My father would come in from the fields and my mother would light up like he was the answer to every prayer she'd ever whispered. And he looked at her the same way, like she was the most precious thing in creation." "That sounds beautiful," Jed said gently. "It was, and for the longest time I thought that was what marriage was supposed to be, what love was supposed to look like." Her voice caught slightly. "When I married Thomas, I kept waiting for that feeling, that sense of coming home to each other, but it never came. Instead, I got well. You know what I got." "The photograph," Jed prompted gently. "You still have it?" "Hidden away in my dresser drawer. I can't bear to look at it most days, but I can't bring myself to throw it away either. It's proof that real love exists, even if it's not for everyone. Even if it's not for me." The last words came out more bitter than she'd intended, and she saw Jed flinch slightly at the pain in her voice. "Maybe it's not that it's not for you," he said carefully. "Maybe you just haven't found the right person to share it with." "Maybe," she said, but her tone suggested she didn't believe it. "Or maybe some of us are just meant to love from a distance, to appreciate what others have without expecting it for ourselves." They sat in silence for a while, the rain continuing its steady percussion on the roof above them. Marion felt exposed, as if her confession had peeled away layers of protection she'd spent years building. But alongside the vulnerability was an unexpected sense of relief. When was the last time she'd spoken about her parents, about the love she'd witnessed as a child? When was the last time anyone had listened without judgment? "I think," Jed said eventually, "that love isn't something you deserve or don't deserve. It's something that happens when two people decide to be brave at the same time." "Brave?" Marion looked at him with curiosity. "Brave enough to be seen, flaws and all. Brave enough to see someone else the same way. Brave enough to believe that what you have to offer might be enough for the right person." His words settled into the space between them like seeds finding fertile ground. Marion found herself thinking about the small kindnesses they'd exchanged over the past few days, the meals shared, the work observed and appreciated, the careful way they'd begun to reveal their histories to each other. Was this what courage looked like? Not the dramatic gesture of running into danger, but the quiet choice to remain present when every instinct screamed to retreat. "The wheel's nearly finished," Jed said, changing the subject with the gentle tact she was beginning to associate with him. "Another day, maybe two, and it'll be ready for the road." The words should have brought relief. Her solitude restored. Her carefully ordered life returned to its familiar rhythms. Instead, she felt something that might have been disappointment, a reluctance to see this interlude end. "That's good," she managed. "You'll be glad to get back to your travels." "Will I?" Jed asked, and there was something in his tone that made her look at him more carefully. "I'm not sure I will, actually. These have been some of the most peaceful days I've had in years." The admission hung between them, loaded with possibilities neither seemed quite ready to examine. But as they finished their breakfast and prepared to return to their respective tasks, Marion found herself wondering what it might mean if Jed's wheel took a little longer to repair. What it might mean if her mountain sanctuary could become, for a little while at least, a place of healing rather than mere hiding. The rain continued, and with it, the slow dissolution of the walls she'd built around her heart. The fourth day dawned clear and bright, and with it came a closeness that neither Marion nor Jed seemed willing to acknowledge directly. She found herself lingering near his work area, offering assistance with tasks that didn't require it, asking questions about blacksmithing that served more to keep him talking than to satisfy any real curiosity about the craft. For his part, Jed seemed to find reasons to slow his progress on the wheel. He would stop frequently to examine his work with the kind of meticulous attention that suggested he was in no hurry to declare it finished. When she brought him water, his fingers would brush hers as he took the cup, contact that lasted a moment longer than necessity demanded. It was during the afternoon, when the mountain heat had driven them both to seek shade on her porch, that the fragile piece they'd built began to crack. Marion had gone inside to fetch them some cold cider, and when she returned, she found Jed studying something he held in his hands with deep concentration. "What's that?" she asked, setting down the pitcher. Jed looked up with the guilty expression of someone caught in a private moment. "I'm sorry it fell out of your apron pocket when you set it on the chair. I was just putting it back when I—" He held up a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and worn soft at the creases. Marion's blood went cold. She knew exactly what that paper was, and her reaction was immediate and instinctive. She snatched the letter from his hands with such violence that he flinched backward. "Don't," she said, her voice sharp with panic. "Don't touch that." But it was too late. The damage was already done, not because Jed had read the letter she could see from his expression that he hadn't, but because he'd seen her reaction to it. The careful trust they'd been building collapsed in an instant, replaced by the familiar walls she threw up whenever her past threatened to intrude on her present. "Marion, I'm sorry," Jed said, rising from his chair with his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "I wasn't trying to pry. It just fell out, and I was only—" "It doesn't matter what you were doing," she snapped, clutching the letter against her chest. "Some things are private." The letter felt like fire against her ribs, even through the fabric of her dress. She'd carried it with her for years, without fully understanding why one of the hateful things Thomas had written to her after she'd fled, filled with threats and promises of what he'd do when he found her. She should have burned it long ago, but something had made her keep it, perhaps as a reminder of why she could never let her guard down completely. Jed was watching her with an expression of careful concern, and she could see him trying to decide whether to retreat or attempt to bridge the sudden chasm that had opened between them. "The war taught me about private things," he said quietly, "about the letters men carry that they don't want anyone else to see. I wasn't trying to intrude on whatever that is." His gentle tone only made her feel worse about her reaction, but the panic was still too fresh, the sense of exposure too complete. "You don't understand," she said, backing toward the cabin door. "There are things people can't know, certain things about me." "What things?" Jed asked, and there was something in his voice that stopped her retreat. Not curiosity or demand, but genuine concern. "What could be so terrible that you can't trust me with it?" The question hung between them, loaded with all the careful intimacy they'd been building over the past few days. Marion found herself at a crossroads. She'd never expected to face the choice between the safety of her secrets and the possibility of true connection with another human being. "He's still looking for me," she whispered, the words barely audible, even in the mountain stillness. "Thomas, my husband. Even after all these years, he's still—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't give voice to the nightmares that visited her in the darkest hours before dawn. Understanding dawned in Jed's eyes, followed immediately by something that looked like fury. But when he spoke, his voice remained carefully controlled. "How do you know?" Marion's hands shook as she unfolded the letter, the paper threatening to tear along the worn creases. "Because he writes to me. Has been writing for years, to post boxes in different towns. Letters that find their way to me through people who think they're doing a kindness, forwarding mail to the woman who lives alone in the mountains." She held the letter out to him, and Jed took it with the reverence someone might show a wounded bird. As his eyes moved across the page, she watched his expression darken. "When did you get this?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. 2 months ago. It came through the postal rider who stops at Clearwater Creek." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the afternoon heat. "He says he's getting closer, that he has men asking questions in all the mountain towns, that when he finds me, he won't." Jed interrupted, the words carrying an absolute certainty that surprised her. "Whatever he's threatening, whatever he thinks he's going to do, it won't happen." "You don't know Thomas," Marion said, shaking her head. "You don't know what he's capable of. He nearly killed me once already, and he spent 10 years nursing that anger, feeding it, making it stronger. And you've spent 10 years getting stronger too." Jed pointed out, "You're not the same woman who ran from him. You've learned to survive, to defend yourself, to live on your own terms. That has to count for something." Marion wanted to believe him, but the fear was too deeply rooted, too much a part of her daily existence. "I thought I was safe here. I thought the mountains were far enough, remote enough. But if he's really getting closer, then we'll deal with it," Jed said simply. "Together." The words stopped her cold. "We? You think I'm going to finish this wheel and ride away, knowing you're in danger?" Jed's eyes held hers steadily. "You think 4 days of your kindness, your trust, your company means so little to me that I'd abandon you when you need help?" "I never asked for your help," Marion said, but the words lacked conviction. "No, you didn't. But you've got it anyway." Jed folded the letter carefully and handed it back to her. "The question is whether you're going to accept it." As she took the letter from his hands, their fingers touched again, and this time neither of them pulled away. In that moment of contact, Marion felt something shift inside her, not the complete dissolution of her fears, but perhaps the beginning of hope that she didn't have to face them alone. The afternoon sun slanted through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out as it rode the mountain thermals. The sound reminded her that even in the wilderness, even in isolation, life found ways to call out to life, to bridge the spaces between one creature and another. Maybe, she thought, it was time to stop hiding from the possibility that someone might answer when she finally found the courage to call back. The 5th morning arrived with an unseasonable chill that made the mountain peaks look sharp enough to cut the sky. Marion woke to the sound of hoofbeats on the trail below, not the familiar rhythm of Jed's mule, but the purposeful cadence of a horse being ridden hard. She was at her window, in seconds, rifle in hand, scanning the tree line for signs of movement. A lone rider emerged from the forest, wearing the distinctive star of a territorial sheriff. He was young, perhaps 30, with the kind of face that had seen enough trouble to age it beyond its years. His horse was lathered with sweat despite the cool morning, suggesting he'd been riding through the night. Marion's first instinct was to hide, to pretend no one was home and wait for the lawman to move on. But Jed was already emerging from the lean-to, alerted by the same sound that had woken her. There was no way to avoid the encounter now. "Morning," the sheriff called out as he approached, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Name's Deputy Marshal Cole Bennett. I'm looking for information about a woman who might be living in these parts." Jed stepped forward, positioning himself between the marshal and the cabin in a way that looked casual but effectively blocked the lawman's direct line of sight to Marion's front door. "What kind of information?" "Missing person case," Bennett replied, dismounting from his horse with the careful movements of someone who'd been in the saddle too long. "Woman named Marion Hartwell. Went missing from down south about 10 years ago. Her husband's been looking for her ever since." The name hit Marion like a physical blow. Hartwell. Her married name, the identity she'd tried so hard to leave behind. She pressed herself against the cabin wall, heart hammering against her ribs as she strained to hear every word of the conversation outside. 10 years is a long time to keep looking," Jed observed, his tone carefully neutral. "Must be some reason he thinks she's in this area." "Recent tip suggested she might have settled somewhere in the Tetons," Bennett said, pulling a folded paper from his saddlebags. "Got a description here, though it's probably outdated. Woman would be in her 50s now, brown hair, about average height. Probably goes by her maiden name Pike, I think it was." Marion's blood turned to ice water. The description was vague enough to fit dozens of women, but the detail about her maiden name meant Thomas had been thorough in his research. How long had he been tracking her movements, piecing together the fragments of her new life? "Haven't seen anyone fitting that description," Jed lied smoothly. "But then folks up here tend to keep to themselves. What's she wanted for?" It was a smart question, and Marion found herself holding her breath as she waited for the answer. If Thomas had somehow convinced the law that she was a criminal, that would explain the official involvement. "Not wanted, exactly," Bennett said, and there was something in his tone that suggested discomfort with his assignment. "Husband says she's not well, needs medical attention. Says she ran off during some kind of breakdown and might be dangerous to herself or others." The lie was so perfectly crafted that Marion almost admired its elegance. Thomas had always been skilled at manipulation, at presenting himself as the concerned, long-suffering husband of a difficult wife. How many people had he convinced over the years that he was the victim in their marriage? "Dangerous how?" Jed pressed, and Marion could hear the skepticism in his voice. Bennett shifted uncomfortably, consulting his notes. "Report says she attacked her husband before disappearing, left him with some serious injuries. There's also concern she might have that she might not be thinking clearly. Isolation can do things to a person's mind." "So can a lot of other things," Jed said quietly, and there was steel beneath the casual words. The marshal looked up at him sharply. "You sound like you speak from experience." "I've seen enough of the world to know that there's usually more than one side to every story," Jed replied, "especially when it comes to missing wives and concerned husbands." Bennett's hand moved fractionally closer to his weapon, and Marion realized the conversation was taking a dangerous turn. If the marshal became suspicious of Jed's questions, if he decided to search the area more thoroughly. "I appreciate your time," Bennett said, folding the paper and returning it to his saddlebags. "But I'd be obliged if you'd keep an eye out. Woman's been missing a long time, and her husband's worried sick. If you do see anyone matching that description, you can get word to me through the sheriff's office in Jackson." From inside the cabin, Marion watched through the window as Bennett produced something else from his saddlebag's metal badge, worn and dented but unmistakably official. He pinned it to his vest with the casual gesture of someone who'd done it countless times. "Course, there might be a reward in it," Bennett added, remounting his horse. "Mr. Hartwell's a man of considerable means, and he's eager to have his wife back home where she belongs." The word "belongs" sent a chill down Marion's spine. She remembered Thomas using that exact phrase during the worst of their fights, reminding her that she belonged to him, that he owned her just as surely as he owned his livestock or his land. "I'll keep that in mind," Jed said, stepping back as Bennett prepared to leave. "You do that," the marshal replied. "And remember, if this woman is as unstable as her husband believes, approaching her could be dangerous. Best to contact the authorities first." Bennett touched his hat brim in farewell and spurred his horse back toward the trail. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the forest, Marion found herself unable to move. paralyzed by the implications of what she'd just heard. Thomas wasn't just looking for her anymore, he'd made it official. He'd convinced law enforcement that she was dangerous, possibly insane, certainly in need of his protective custody. The badge Bennett wore might have been legitimate, or it might have been another of Thomas's elaborate deceptions. Either way, it meant her husband had resources she'd never imagined, connections that reached far beyond the small town where their marriage had died. Jed appeared in her doorway, his face grim with understanding. "How much of that did you hear?" "Enough," Marion whispered, sinking into her kitchen chair. "He's turned me into a criminal, Jed, made me the villain in our story. Anyone who helps me now becomes an accomplice toto, whatever crime he's claiming I committed." "You defended yourself," Jed said firmly, kneeling beside her chair. "Whatever you did to get away from him, it was self-defense." "Try explaining that to a judge," Marion said bitterly. "Especially when the complaining witness is a respectable businessman, and I'm a crazy woman who's been living alone in the mountains for 10 years. Who do you think they're going to believe?" Jed was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him working through the implications, understanding the trap Thomas had so carefully constructed. By making her disappearance a matter of law enforcement, he'd eliminated her ability to simply keep running. Now, anyone who encountered her would be obligated to turn her in, and anyone who helped her would be breaking the law themselves. "The marshal didn't seem entirely convinced," Jed said finally. "Did you notice that? The way he talked about the case, like he had doubts about the story he'd been told." "It doesn't matter what he believes," Marion replied. "He has his orders, and Thomas has his badge. That's all that matters now." "No," Jed said, rising to his feet with sudden determination. "What matters now is deciding what we're going to do about it. Because running isn't an option anymore, and hiding sure as hell isn't working." Marion looked up at him, seeing something in his expression she hadn't witnessed before, not just the gentle kindness that had drawn her to trust him, but something harder, more dangerous. The soldier he'd once been, perhaps, or simply a man who'd reached the limit of what he was willing to accept. "What are you suggesting?" she asked quietly. "I'm suggesting," Jed said, "that it's time to stop letting Thomas Hartwell control your story. Time to take the fight to him before he brings it here." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and terrible risk. Outside, the mountains stood silent witness to a moment that would change everything, the moment when two damaged souls decided they'd rather face their demons together than spend another day running from them alone. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cabin porch as Marion and Jed sat facing each other, the weight of their decision settling between them like an uninvited guest. The rifle that had hung above her mantle for 10 years now lay across her lap, its familiar weight both comforting and ominous. She'd cleaned and loaded it with the methodical precision of someone preparing for war, her hands steady despite the tremor in her heart. "Tell me about him," Jed said quietly, his own preparations spread across the wooden table maps of the surrounding territory, notes about possible approach routes, and his traveling pack reorganized for quick movement. "Not the marriage, not what he did to you. Tell me about Thomas as a man, his habits, his weaknesses, how he thinks." Marion's fingers traced the carved stock of the rifle, worn smooth by her father's hands years before it had become her lifeline. "He's patient," she said finally. "That's what made him so dangerous as a husband, and what makes him dangerous now. He doesn't act in anger, he plans, calculates. He'll have thought through every possible scenario before he makes his move. But he's also arrogant," she continued, memories surfacing with painful clarity. "He believes he's the smartest person in any room, and that blinds him to possibilities he hasn't considered. During our marriage, he never expected me to fight back because he'd convinced himself I was too weak, too dependent on him." Jed nodded, making mental notes. "What about the marshal? Do you think he was legitimate law enforcement, or one of Thomas's men?" "I don't know," Marion admitted. "Thomas has money, influence. He could have bought a badge easily enough, or convinced a real lawman that his story was true. Either way, it doesn't change what we're facing." They'd spent the morning developing what Jed called their defensive strategy, though both of them knew it was really preparation for the inevitable confrontation. Thomas would come of that, they were certain. The only questions were when and how. "He'll approach at night," Marion said with grim certainty. "He always preferred darkness for his worst behavior, made him feel more powerful, I think, knowing I couldn't see what was coming." "Then we'll be ready for him," Jed replied, checking the cylinder of his service revolver with practiced efficiency. "But Marion, I need you to understand something. When this happens, and it will happen, there may not be a way to resolve it peacefully. Are you prepared for that?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to examine too closely. Marion thought of the woman she'd been 10 years ago, the frightened girl who'd run into the mountains with nothing but terror driving her forward. That woman would have been paralyzed by the prospect of violence, incapable of defending herself, even when her life depended on it. But the mountains had changed her. 10 years of survival, of making life or death decisions every day, of learning that sometimes the world demanded strength, whether you felt ready to provide it or not. Those years had forged something different from the broken wife who'd fled Thomas's house. "I won't run again," she said, and her voice carried a certainty that surprised them both. "Whatever happens, wherever this leads, I'm done running from him." Jed studied her face in the afternoon light, perhaps seeing for the first time the steel that lay beneath her careful reserve. "Good," he said simply, "because I meant what I said yesterday. You don't face this alone." "Why?" The question escaped before she could stop it, carrying all the vulnerability she'd tried so hard to hide. "Why are you willing to risk this? You could ride away tonight, be safe from whatever's coming. Why stay for someone you've known less than a week?" Jed was quiet for a long moment, his hands stilling on the map he'd been studying. When he finally looked up, his eyes held something she'd never seen there before, not just kindness or sympathy, but something deeper, more personal. "Because in 5 days, you've shown me more genuine care and acceptance than I've known in 15 years of wandering," he said quietly. "Because when you look at me, you don't see a damaged soldier or a man too dangerous to love. You see someone worth feeding, worth talking to, worth trusting with your secrets." His words struck her with unexpected force, revealing how much their tentative connection had meant to him as well. She thought of the careful way he'd revealed his own wounds, the trust he'd shown in admitting his fears about his war-damaged mind. How long had it been since anyone had seen past his scars to the good man beneath? "And," Jed continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "because I'm falling in love with you. And I'll be damned if I let that bastard take away the first real happiness I've known since before the war." The confession hit her like lightning, illuminating feelings she'd been afraid to acknowledge, even to herself. In the space of a heartbeat, everything shifted, not just the nature of what they were preparing to defend, but the recognition of what they stood to lose if they failed. "Jed," she began, but he held up a hand. "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly. "I know it's too soon, too complicated, but when someone's pointing a gun at what matters to you, it clarifies things in a hurry." Marion set the rifle aside and reached across the table to take his scarred hands in hers. "It's not too soon," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "And it's not too complicated, it's just I haven't been touched gently in 10 years, Jed. I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone care whether I lived or died, let alone—" She stopped, the words too big and too fragile for the moment. "Let alone what?" he prompted gently. "Let alone love me," she finished, the admission scraping her throat raw. "I'd convinced myself that part of my life was over, that I was too damaged, too set in my ways, too afraid to ever—" She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Jed understood, just as he'd understood everything else she'd struggled to put into words over the past few days. "Maybe we're both too damaged for what normal people call love," he said, still holding her hands. "But maybe that's exactly why we understand each other. Maybe two broken people can build something stronger than either could manage alone." The sound of approaching horses cut through their conversation like a blade. Not one rider this time, but several, moving with the coordinated precision of men who'd worked together before. Marion felt her blood turn to ice as she recognized the tactical approach-flanking movements designed to cut off escape routes, the methodical advance of predators closing in on prey. "He's here," she whispered, though they both already knew. Jed was on his feet instantly, checking his weapon one final time. "How many?" Marion moved to the window, peering through the gap in the curtains. "4, maybe 5. They're spreading out, surrounding the cabin." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she picked up the rifle, just like Thomas, to bring overwhelming force. He never did believe in fair fights. "Remember what we talked about," Jed said, moving to his position by the front door. "Stay low, watch your angles, and don't hesitate. Men like that count on their victims being too civilized to fight back effectively." As if summoned by their conversation, a familiar voice called out from the darkness beyond her porch. Rich, cultured, carrying the same tone of reasonable authority that had once fooled her into thinking she was marrying a gentleman. "Marion, darling," Thomas Hartwell called, his voice carrying easily across the clearing. "I know you're in there. It's time to come home." The sound of her husband's voice, after 10 years of blessed silence, hit her like a physical blow. All the old fears came rushing back, the learned helplessness, the ingrained response to his tone of command. For a moment, she was 25 again, small and frightened, and convinced that resistance would only make things worse. But then she felt Jed's presence beside her, solid and reassuring, and remembered the woman she'd become in the mountains. Thomas might have found her, might have brought his bought badges and hired guns, but he hadn't counted on finding her changed. He was still thinking of the broken girl who'd fled his house, not the woman who'd survived a decade in the wilderness. "I'm not coming anywhere with you, Thomas," she called back, pleased to find her voice steady and strong. "And I'm not your darling anymore." Harsh laughter echoed from the tree line. "Oh, Marion, my poor deluded wife, do you really think 10 years of playing mountain woman changes what you are? You're still mine, still my responsibility, and I've come to take you home." The words carried all the old possessive certainty, the absolute conviction that she belonged to him regardless of her own wishes. But they also carried something newer, hard edge of anger that spoke of 10 years of frustrated pursuit, of a man unaccustomed to being denied. "Last chance, darling," Thomas called. "Come out peacefully, and we can discuss your medical treatment like civilized people. Force me to come in after you and, well, let's just say I might not be able to guarantee your safety." Marion looked at Jed, seeing her own determination reflected in his weathered features. They'd made their choice, drawn their line in the sand. Whatever came next, they would face it together. "Go to hell, Thomas," she called back, chambering a round in her rifle with a sound that carried clearly in the mountain air. The time for running was over. The time for hiding was past. Now came the reckoning that had been 10 years in the making. The silence that followed Marion's defiant response stretched taut as a bowstring, filled with the potential energy of violence about to unfold. Through the cabin window, she could see shadows moving between the trees. Thomas's men taking their positions with military precision. Her husband had always been thorough in his planning, and tonight would be no exception. "You always were stubborn," Thomas called out, his voice carrying a note of fond exasperation, as if he were discussing a wayward child rather than a woman fighting for her freedom. "But we both know how this ends, darling. You can't hide behind that stranger forever." The hunting knife her father had given her on her 16th birthday lay on the table beside her rifle, its blade honed to razor sharpness. She'd carried it through every day of her mountain exile, using it to dress game, carve wood, and perform the countless small tasks that had kept her alive. Now it might serve a darker purpose, the final proof of how far she'd traveled from the frightened girl who'd once cowered before Thomas's anger. "I count at least 4 of them," Jed whispered from his position by the door, his war-trained eyes tracking movement in the darkness. "Thomas and 3 others. Maybe more I can't see. They're good, disciplined, patient. This isn't his first time hunting someone." Marion's stomach clenched at the thought. How many other women had Thomas pursued over the years? How many had he convinced the authorities were mentally unstable, dangerous, in need of his protective custody? The badge Deputy Marshal Bennett had worn might represent legitimate law enforcement, or it might be the latest tool in a pattern of predation that stretched back years. "Marion," Thomas's voice came again, closer now, accompanied by the soft crunch of boots on pine needles. "I'm going to give you one more chance to be reasonable. Walk out that door, and we can discuss your treatment options like civilized people. Make me come in after you, and I can't be responsible for what happens to your friend." The threat was clear, and Marion felt the familiar chill of Thomas's calculated cruelty. He knew exactly how to hurt her, not just through direct violence, but by threatening anyone who dared to show her kindness. How many times during their marriage had he warned her that defiance would result in consequences for others? How many small acts of rebellion had she abandoned rather than risk his displeasure falling on innocent bystanders? But Jed wasn't innocent, and he wasn't helpless. The revolver in his hands bore the weight of experience, and his eyes held the cold certainty of a man who'd faced death before and refused to blink. "He's trying to separate us," Jed murmured, his voice barely audible. "Classic tactic, make you feel responsible for whatever happens to me, so you'll surrender to protect me. Don't let him in your head, Marion. We're stronger together than either of us is alone." A shadow moved across the window, and Marion caught a glimpse of a face she'd tried for 10 years to forget. Thomas looked older than she remembered, his hair gone completely grey, his once handsome features hardened by years of frustrated pursuit. But his eyes held the same cold calculation she remembered from their worst fights, the same absolute certainty that he was entitled to whatever he chose to take. "There she is," Thomas said, his voice warm with satisfaction as he spotted her through the glass. "My beautiful wayward wife. You've grown thin, darling. Mountain living doesn't suit you, but don't worry, we'll have you back to your proper weight in no time." The casual possessiveness in his tone sent rage coursing through Marion's veins, burning away the last traces of the old fear. This man had stolen years of her life, had convinced her she was worthless, had driven her into exile in the wilderness. And now he stood outside her sanctuary, speaking as if she were livestock he'd come to collect. "I'm not your wife anymore, Thomas," she called back, surprised by the steel in her own voice. "I stopped being your wife the night you tried to strangle me in our bedroom." "Now, Marion, you know that's not how it happened," Thomas replied, his tone patient and condescending. "You had one of your episodes, started screaming and carrying on. I was only trying to calm you down when you attacked me with that kitchen knife. The scars on my shoulder still ache when it rains." The revisionist history was so perfectly crafted, so smoothly delivered, that for a moment Marion almost doubted her own memories. This was Thomas's greatest weapon, not physical violence, but the ability to rewrite reality, to make his victims question their own experiences until they no longer trusted their own perceptions. But the mountains had taught her to trust her instincts, and her instincts told her that this man's version of events was a lie built to justify the unjustifiable. "The only episode I had was 10 years of believing your lies," she shot back. "But I'm done with that now." Thomas's laugh held no humor, only the cold amusement of a predator who'd grown tired of playing with his prey. "Oh, darling, you really have lost touch with reality, haven't you? But that's all right. The doctors will help you remember things properly once we get you to the hospital." The word hospital sent ice through Marion's veins. She'd heard stories, whispered tales of inconvenient wives who disappeared into private sanitariums, never to be seen again. With his money and influence, Thomas could easily arrange for her to vanish into such a place, declared mentally incompetent and stripped of all rights. "Time's up, Marion," Thomas announced. "Boys, you know what to do." The assault began with brutal efficiency, windows shattering, the door splintering under the impact of shoulders and boots. In seconds, her sanctuary became a battlefield, filled with shouting voices and the acrid smell of gunpowder. But as the first armed figure burst through her doorway, Marion felt something she hadn't experienced in 10 years of exile. She was not afraid. The knife in her hand felt solid and real, an extension of her will made manifest in steel. She was done running, done hiding, done being the victim in Thomas Hartwell's story. Now, finally, she would write her own ending. The first man through the door moved with the practiced aggression of hired muscle, but he hadn't counted on facing a woman who'd spent 10 years learning to kill or be killed in the wilderness. Marion's rifle spoke first, the shot echoing off the cabin walls like thunder. The intruder stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder, his weapon clattering across the wooden floor. Jed moved with the fluid precision of his military training, his revolver barking twice in rapid succession. The second attacker dropped where he stood, while a third dove for cover behind Marion's kitchen table. In the space of heartbeats, her carefully ordered sanctuary had become a war zone, filled with gun smoke and the groans of wounded men. "Enough!" Thomas's voice cut through the chaos like a blade, carrying an authority that made even his hired guns pause. "That's enough shooting. We do this my way now." Through the shattered doorway, Marion could see her husband step into view, his hands raised in a gesture of apparent surrender. But she knew Thomas too well to trust the performance. Behind him, she caught glimpses of at least 2 more men, positioned to provide covering fire if the situation deteriorated further. "Very impressive, darling," Thomas said, surveying the carnage with the detached interest of a man examining a particularly clever chess move. 10 years in the mountains have certainly changed you. The woman I married couldn't have hit the broadside of a barn, let alone put a bullet exactly where she intended." There was genuine admiration in his voice, which somehow made it more terrifying than his earlier threats. This was Thomas at his most dangerous, when he was intrigued rather than simply angry, when he saw her resistance as a puzzle to be solved rather than defiance to be crushed. "But surely you realize this changes nothing," he continued, stepping carefully over the wounded man at his feet. "You've proven you can fight, yes, but you can't win. Not against the law, not against the resources I have at my disposal. All you've done is ensure that your return to civilization will be more complicated." Jed shifted position, keeping his weapon trained on Thomas, while scanning for the other threats he couldn't see. The war medal he carried in his pocket seemed to pulse against his ribs, a reminder of battles fought and won against impossible odds. This wouldn't be the first time he'd faced superior numbers, and if Marion's courage held, it wouldn't be the first time he emerged victorious. "The only thing complicated here is your delusion that she's going anywhere with you," Jed said, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a man who'd made his peace with violence. "Marion made her choice 10 years ago when she left you. Today she's making it again." Thomas's attention shifted to Jed for the first time, studying him with the clinical interest of a scientist examining a new specimen. "Ah, yes, the mysterious protector. Tell me, friend, do you have any idea what you're really defending? This woman is mentally ill, prone to violent episodes, legally incompetent to make decisions about her own welfare. I have court documents, medical opinions, sworn statements." "You have lies," Marion interrupted, stepping into view with her father's hunting knife gleaming in her hand. "Well, crafted lies backed by money and influence, but lies nonetheless." The sight of the blade seemed to trigger something primal in Thomas's expression, a flicker of recognition that took him back to their final night together. For just a moment, his careful composure cracked, revealing the rage that had driven him through 10 years of pursuit. "You cut me," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "In our own bedroom, with that very knife, drew my blood like some kind of savage. Do you remember that night, Marion? Do you remember what you did?" "I remember defending myself," Marion replied, raising the knife so the lamplight caught its edge. "I remember a woman who'd finally had enough of being strangled in her sleep, hit when she displeased you, treated like property instead of a person. That woman picked up this knife and carved herself a way out of hell. And I've spent 10 years bringing you home," Thomas said, his mask of civilized concern finally slipping away entirely. 10 years, tracking you through every miserable frontier town, following every lead, bribing every official. Do you have any idea what you've cost me?" What your little rebellion has done to my reputation, my standing in the community. The truth of it hung between them now, stripped of all pretense. This had never been about love or concern for her welfare. It had been about ownership, about a man's wounded pride at having his property escape his control. "Then consider this your final payment," Marion said, and lunged forward with the knife. The blade found its mark, sliding between Thomas's ribs with the same precision she'd learned gutting deer in the wilderness. He looked down at the growing red stain on his shirt with something approaching surprise, as if he'd never quite believed she was capable of following through on her threats. "You always underestimated me," Marion whispered as Thomas sank to his knees, "right up until the very end." The gunfire that followed was brief and decisive. Jed's military training served them both well, his shots finding their targets, while Thomas's remaining men hesitated, uncertain whether to fight or flee now that their employer was down. When the smoke cleared, only Marion and Jed remained standing in the wreckage of her cabin, their hands stained with the blood of men who'd come to drag her back into captivity. But for the first time in 10 years, Marion Pike was truly free. 3 weeks after the confrontation that had shattered the windows of her cabin and ended Thomas Hartwell's decade-long pursuit, Marion stood in the doorway, watching Jed work at his forge. The temporary repairs they'd made to her sanctuary were holding well, though she decided some changes were needed. A place that had served as a hiding spot for 10 years needed to become something different, now a home where two people could build a life together. The sound of his hammer on the anvil had become as familiar as her own heartbeat, but today he was crafting something different from the usual practical ironwork. She could see the careful attention he paid to each strike, the artistic precision that transformed raw metal into something approaching beauty. When he finally held up his work to examine it in the afternoon light, she saw what had occupied his careful attention for the past several days. It was a ring, simple, elegant, forged from iron that had been heated and shaped with the same patient skill he brought to all his work. Not gold or silver, those precious metals had no place in a life built around practical survival and hard-won happiness. But iron was honest, durable, and in Jed's capable hands, it became something precious in its own way. "It's beautiful," she said, stepping out onto the porch where glass still sparkled in the corners from the shattered windows. Jed looked up with the shy smile she'd grown to love, the expression that transformed his weathered features and reminded her of the gentleness that lay beneath his battle-scarred exterior. "It's not much," he said, setting down his hammer. "But I thought, that is, I hoped." "Yes," Marion said before he could finish the question she saw forming in his eyes. "I haven't even asked you properly," Jed protested, though his smile grew wider. "You don't need to," she replied, extending her left hand toward him. "I've been waiting for someone to ask me the right question for 10 years. I think I know what it sounds like when I hear it." The ring slipped onto her finger with the perfect fit of something designed specifically for her hand. The metal was still warm from the forge, carrying the heat of its creation and the intention behind its making. As she admired the way it caught the light, Marion thought of the other ring she'd worn briefly. A lifetime ago, Thomas's expensive band that had felt like a shackle from the moment he'd placed it on her finger. This was different. This was a promise made between equals, a choice freely given and freely received. "I love you," Jed said, the words carrying the weight of a man who'd learned not to speak lightly of such things. "I love your strength, your courage, the way you've survived everything that should have broken you. I love waking up to the sound of you humming your mother's hymns while you make breakfast. I love watching you work in your garden, seeing the way you've made life bloom in this harsh place." "I love you too," Marion replied, tears threatening as she spoke the words she'd never thought she'd have the chance to mean again. "I love the way you see beauty in broken things, the way you fix what needs fixing without trying to change what doesn't. I love that you chose to stay when you could have ridden away safely. I love that you helped me remember who I was before fear made me forget." They stood together in the afternoon sunlight, two people who'd found each other at the exact moment when they'd both stopped looking for love. Around them, the mountains rose in eternal silence, bearing witness to a moment of perfect understanding between souls that had traveled long and difficult roads to reach this place. "So what do we do now?" Jed asked, his arms encircling her waist in a gesture that felt as natural as breathing. "Now we live," Marion said simply. "We fix the cabin, tend the garden, prepare for winter. We build the kind of life we both stopped believing was possible. And if anyone comes looking for us, if there are questions about what happened here..." Marion glanced toward the small grove of pine trees where they'd buried Thomas and his men, marked only by stones that would weather into anonymity with time. Deputy Marshal Bennett hadn't returned, and she suspected he never would. Men like Thomas often made enemies along with their victims, and not all of those enemies would mourn his passing. "Then we'll face whatever comes together," she said. "But I'm done running, done hiding from the possibility of happiness, because someone might try to take it away. Life's too short and too precious to waste on fear." As if summoned by her words, the evening wind stirred the pines around her cabin, carrying the scent of mountain air and approaching autumn. Soon the leaves would turn, the first snows would dust the peaks, and the cycle of seasons that had marked her solitary years would continue. But this time, she wouldn't face the long winter alone. "I haven't been touched gently in 10 years, she whispered, echoing the words she'd never quite found the courage to speak aloud during their careful courtship. Jed's response came not in words but in the tender touch of his hand against her cheek, fingers tracing the lines that wind and worry had carved there, with the reverence of a man who understood that some kinds of beauty only came with survival. His kiss, when it came, carried the promise of all the gentle touches that lay ahead mornings, waking beside each other, hands linked while they watched the sunrise, the simple miracle of human connection after years of isolation. When they finally broke apart, the sun had begun its descent behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own small victories and quiet joys. There would be a winter to prepare for, a damaged cabin to fully repair, a life to build from the foundation of mutual respect and hard-won trust. But tonight, as the first stars appeared above the Tetons and the sound of Jed's gentle breathing mingled with the whisper of wind through the pines, Marion Pike, soon to be Marion Boone, fell, asleep, listening to the sound of another person's heart beating beside her own. For the first time in 10 years, she was not alone, and she never would be again.